Black Hearts in Battersea by Joan Aiken, Chapter 5. Next day, chancing to wake early, Simon looked out of his front window into Rose Alley and saw his unfortunate donkey, Caroline, struggling to pull an outrageously heavy milk cart loaded with churns, and being encouraged thereto by the shrewish dairywoman, who was beating her with a curtain pole. Simon threw on his clothes and ran down to the street. "Hey!" he shouted after the milkwoman. She turned scowling and snapped, "Penny a gill, and only if you've got your own jug." "I don't want milk," Simon said. Indeed, it looked very blue and watery. "I want my donkey!" And before she could object, he kicked a brick under the wheel of the cart and slipped the relieved Caroline out from between the shafts. In 2 days she seemed to have grown noticeably thinner, and have acquired several wheels. "I'm not leaving her with you a minute longer," Simon told the woman. "You ought to be ashamed to treat her so." "I suppose you're the president of the Royal Humane Society," she sneered. Then she turned and bawled, "Todd, bring the mule!" "Coming, Aunt Poke," called a voice, and the boy Todd appeared, leading a scraggly mule with one hand and holding his trousers around his neck with the other. He put out his tongue at Simon and remarked, "What price cat's meat?" And it was still very early, and Simon decided this would be a good time to make inquiries about Dr. Field at the shops in the neighborhood. There was a greengrocer's next to the dairy, adorned with piles of wizened radishes and bunches of drooping parsley. He saw Mrs. Grotch, Aunt Tinty, watering these with dirty water from a battered can. Guessing that he would get no help from her, he passed to the next shop, a bakery. "Can you tell me if Dr. Gabriel Field ever bought bread here?" he asked, stepping into the warm, sweet-smelling place. "Dr. Field," the baker scratched his head, then called to his wife, "Polly, know anything about a Dr. Field?" "Was he the one lost Susie's carbuncle?" The baker's wife came through into the shop, wiping her hands on her apron. Just at that moment, Simon heard a voice behind him. Todd, having harnessed the mule to his Aunt Poke's milk float, had wandered along the lane and was spinning a top outside the door and singing in a loud, shrill voice, "Ninny, ninny, not! My name's Tom Tit Tot." Whether this song had any effect on the baker and his wife, or whether they had just recollected a piece of urgent business, Simon could not be sure, but the baker said hastily, "No, there's not a doctor of that name round here, young man," and hurried out of the shop, while his wife cried, "Mercy, my rolls are burning," and bustled after him. Simon walked the length of the row of shops, asking at each one, but all his questions, perhaps because of Todd, were equally fruitless, and at length, discouraged, he set off for the academy, while Todd turned a series of cartwheels along Rose Alley, keeping his trousers on only with the greatest difficulty, and launched into a defiant shout of, "My name's Tom Tit Tot!" After Simon, which it seemed wisest to ignore. It was still only 7:30, so there was time to call at the Cobbs and ask if Caroline might be boarded at the stables there. The Cobbs were at breakfast and received Simon with great cordiality, offering him marmalade pie, cold fowl, and hot-boiled ham. Mrs. Cobb, a stout motherly woman, insisted on his having a mug of her breakfast special to see him through the day. This was a nourishing mixture of hot milk and spices, tasting indeed so powerfully of aniseed that Simon thought it would see him through not only that day, but several days to come. "Ah, it's a regular cockle-warmer, Flossie's breakfast special," Mr. Cobb said fondly and proudly. "You see, young'un, my wife was a fidget. From loose chippings, those fidget girls know more about housewifery and the domestic arts by the time they marry than most women learn in a lifetime." Simon was very interested to hear that Mrs. Cobb came from the same part of the country as himself, while Mrs. Cobb was amazed to learn that Simon had passed the early part of his life at Gloober's poor farm. "And you such a stout, sensible lad, too!" she exclaimed. "I thought they all turned out half-starved and wanting in the head, poor things. Of course we'll keep the donkey here, and gladly, won't we, Cobby? The lad won't mind if little Libby has a turn-out on her now and then, I dare say," as little Libby Cobb was only 2 and looked extremely seraphic in complete contrast to Miss Ditto Twite. Simon had not the least objection to this. He bade farewell to the Cobbs, hastened down to the academy, and set to work in the mausoleum, drawing a bronze figure with a trident. He had not, however, been at this occupation very long when Dr. Furneaux appeared and whisked him away to another room, where an old lavender seller had been established with her baskets on a platform, to have her portrait painted by a dozen students. They had been working for a couple of hours, and Dr. Furneaux was giving a lecture from the platform, largely incomprehensible because he had somehow got his whiskers smothered in charcoal dust and kept breaking off to sneeze when two people entered the room. Glancing around his easel, Simon recognized the boy Justin, whom he now knew to be young Lord Bakerloo, the Duke of Battersea's nephew, and his tutor, the pale-eyed Mr. Buckle. Justin looked wan but triumphant. His right arm was heavily bandaged, and he carried it in a sling. Buckle addressed Dr. Furneaux in low tones. Meanwhile, Justin had caught sight of Simon and nodded to him familiarly. "Brought it off," he confided, gesturing to his bandaged arm, which appeared to give him no great pain. "Done old Furneaux's brown, I have. Can't paint with my dib-dabs in a cloud, can I?" "Did you take a toss?" Simon asked, remembering the headlong way Justin had galloped across the twilit park. "Walker," Justin replied, laying the first finger of his left hand alongside his nose. "That'd be telling." Yes, indeed, most regrettable," Mr. Buckle was saying sorrowfully to Dr. Furneaux. "But we must be thankful the accident was no worse. The doctor fears Lord Bakerloo will not be able to use his right hand for at least a month." "My dear Justin, my poor Justin," Dr. Furneaux exclaimed warmly, darting to Justin, who winced away nervously. "This is most tragic news. A painter has no business with riding on a horse. It is by far too dangerous." "I'm not a painter, I'm a duke's grandson," Justin muttered, but he concealed from Dr. Furneaux his look of satisfaction at being told not to return until his arm was completely healed. When evening came and the students departed to their homes, Simon returned to Mr. Cobb's yard, where he was to meet Sophie, and occupied the interval by blacksmith's work. He had just finished bending an iron rim into a wheel when she arrived. "Why," cried Mr. Cobb, "is that your friend? It's the bonny lass as waits on her grace. Dang me, but you're a lucky young fellow." Sophie had brought a basket of fruit, and proposed that she and Simon should walk into Battersea Park and eat their supper sitting on the grass. But the hospitable Mr. Cobb would not hear of such a plan. "Look at the sky," he admonished them, full to busting. There's enough rain up there for a week of Sundays. You'll just be a-setting down to your first nibble when it comes peltering down on you. No, you come upstairs and eat your dinner comfortable under a roof. Flossie would never let me hear the last of it if I let two young'uns go off to catch their deaths of pneumonia." Simon protested that he was putting the Cobbs to a deal too much trouble, but the sky was indeed very threatening, and they finally accepted, and in return offered to mind Miss Libby Cobb while her mother slipped away around the corner to buy 2 pounds of best fresh and a gallon jar of pickled onions. Young Miss Cobb proved remarkably easy to amuse. She and the kitten chased one another till both were exhausted, and when that happened, Simon or Sophie had only to initiate the noise of some animal to put her into fits of laughter. Meanwhile, Sophie told Simon all that had happened to her since Simon had run away from Gloober's poor farm. "I was lucky," she said. "You remember I always liked needlework, and Mrs. Gloober used to get me to do her mending. Then she began buying fashion magazines and bringing them home for me to make up her dresses. One time I was at work on a blue pied de chamois, a ball dress, with Van Dykes of lace and plush roses, when Her Grace the Duchess came in to inspect the poor farm, and saw the dress. Next day a pony trap came from Chipping's castle. The Duchess's compliments, and she'd take the little girl who was so clever with her needle to be a sewing maid. Mrs. Gloober was very angry, but she didn't dare refuse because the Duchess was on the board. But she packed me off without a thing to wear. Since then Her Grace has been so kind to me, and now I'm her lady's maid. When their Graces come up to London for the summer, I came with them." Then Simon in turn told his story, finishing with the mysterious disappearance of Dr. Field and the odd and suspicious behavior of the Twite family. Meanwhile, Libby Cobb had again started in pursuit of the kitten. At this moment she caught her foot on a thick rag rug, the pride of Mrs. Cobb's heart. tripped and fell against the door opening to a stairhead onto the stairhead. Not firmly latched, it flew open, and there was a thump and a shout. Sophie sprang to catch Libby before she could tumble downstairs and exclaimed, "Why, it's Jem! Whatever are you doing there, Jem?" Jem, indeed it was, but in no condition to answer. He must have been just outside the door when Libby fell against it, and the unexpected push had sent him down the stairs. He lay, groaning at the bottom. "We'd best get the poor fellow up here," Simon proposed. But before they could do so, Mrs. Cobb returned from her shopping, and let out a shriek of dismay. Jem, my man, never tell me you're in the wars again. Just when I'd set you right with a tar poultice, what happened?" she asked, as she and Simon between them supported the unlucky Jem up the stairs. "The door flew open and knocked me down," he muttered. "And what was you doing then? Listening at the keyhole?" Jem turned pale. "Nay, only my joke. Lad, never heed it. I do believe all the ill luck in Battersea falls on your poor head. Come you in and lie down on Libby's bed, while I put a bit of vinegar on it." While Mrs. Cobb ministered to the afflicted Jem, Sophie flew about very capably, and set to cooking the best fresh, and Simon made a monstrous heap of toast, and extracted the stopper of the pickle onion jar. They soon sat down to a very cheerful meal with the Cobbs. Sophie and Mrs. Cobb had a fine time exchanging gossip, for Mrs. Cobb, it appeared, had been a parlour maid at Chipping's Castle before she got married. "Ah, you're clever in working for her, my Grace," she declared. "As sweet a lady as you'll not find this side of Ticklepenny Corner. Poor thing, it's a shame she never had no little ones of her own. If she'd a had, I'll be bound they'd be worth 20 of that puny little white whey-faced lad they call Lord Bakerloo. He's the Duke's nevy, you see," she went on, like an old retainer's. She loved talking about the family. "The Duke's younger brother, Henry, he married his own cousin, and they had Justin, that was born abroad in Hanoverian parts and sent back to England as a babby